The first time I realized my husband had lived an entire second life. It wasn't through whispers or rumors or late-night phone calls. It happened at his funeral. I was 66 years old, standing in the front row of a quiet church in Savannah, Georgia, dressed in black, my hands folded the way widows are expected to fold them, when I felt the air change. You know that feeling, the one where something invisible enters the room and your body reacts before your mind can explain it. My name is Margaret Collins, and for 41 years I believed I knew the man in the casket. I believed I had shared his ambitions, his disappointments, his routines, his silence. I believed I had buried my husband that morning. What I hadn't buried, what no one warned me about, was the truth. As the minister spoke about loyalty and devotion, the doors at the back of the church opened. Not loudly, just enough to draw attention, and that's when I saw them. A woman about my age, maybe a few years younger, holding the hands of two grown men who looked unsettlingly familiar. They weren't guests. They weren't mourners. They walked with ownership, with certainty, with the kind of grief that assumes entitlement. The woman met my eyes for a brief second, not with shame, not with fear, but with recognition. In that moment, I understood everything without a single word being spoken. My husband hadn't just betrayed me in secret. He had built another family beside mine, and he had died believing I would never find out, never question it, never survive it with my dignity intact. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already prepared for this day years ago. And funerals, I would soon learn, are not just for endings. Sometimes they are where reckonings begin. I didn't move when I saw them. That surprised me later because younger versions of myself would have reacted, stood up, demanded answers, let emotion spill into the aisle. But grief has a way of stripping performance from a person. It leaves only instinct, and my instinct at that moment was stillness. I watched as the woman guided the two men into a pew near the middle, her hand resting protectively on one of their shoulders. They were in their 30s, maybe early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered. One of them had my husband's exact jawline. The other shared his eyes, the same deep-set brown eyes that had once convinced me to trust without question. I felt my breath slow instead of quicken. That was the first sign something inside me had changed. The minister's voice faded into background noise as memory rushed forward, rearranging itself with brutal clarity. All the business trips that ran long, the holidays he insisted on spending alone to reflect. The accounts I was told were handled. Mailbox key he never let me touch. I had noticed these things over the years, of course, but noticing and knowing are different acts. I had chosen peace over suspicion, trust over paranoia. And now, sitting in that church, I understood exactly what that choice had cost me. When the service ended, people stood and turned toward me with the practiced sympathy reserved for long-term wives. I accepted their hugs, their murmured condolences. I felt the woman's eyes on me the entire time. She waited. She didn't approach, not yet. That restraint told me more about her than confrontation ever could. She wasn't reckless. She believed she had time. She believed she had rights. And she believed, this was the part that almost made me smile, that I was exactly what I appeared to be, an aging widow, stunned, fragile, and unprepared for what was coming next. She approached me only after most of the guests had filtered out, when the room had softened into that awkward, quiet funerals always leave behind. Chairs half empty, flowers beginning to wilt. My children, my known children, had stepped outside to get air. That's when she stood in front of me, close enough that I could smell her perfume. Not cheap, not subtle either, confident, deliberate. "Margaret," she said gently, as if she'd practiced my name. "We should talk." I looked at her then, really looked. The careful hair, the steady posture, the way her grief carried expectation instead of uncertainty. This wasn't a mistress trembling in the shadows. This was a woman who believed she had standing. "Now isn't the time," I replied calmly, surprising both of us. She hesitated, clearly recalculating. "There are things you should know," she said. I nodded once. "I already do." That stopped her. For a brief second, the mask slipped, replaced by confusion. I didn't wait for her to recover. I turned and walked away, not out of weakness, but control. That moment mattered. It set the tone. I wasn't chasing explanations. I wasn't begging for truth. I was choosing when the conversation would happen, and that choice alone shifted the balance of power. That night, after the house emptied and silence settled in, I went upstairs to the study my husband had insisted was his space. I unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk using a key I'd had for years and never needed, until now. Inside was a neatly organized folder labeled Contingencies. I smiled faintly. Men who live double lives often believe they're clever enough to manage the fallout. What they forget is that clever men leave trails, and women who are patient enough know exactly when to follow them. I sat at his desk long after midnight, the house wrapped in a silence so deep it felt deliberate, as if even the walls were waiting to see what I would do next. The folder was thick, too thick for a man with nothing to hide. Inside were documents arranged with obsessive care, copies of deeds, insurance policies, bank statements, and a handwritten list of names I recognized immediately. Her name. The two men's names, dates, addresses, birth certificates. He hadn't just lived a second life, he had archived it. What chilled me wasn't the scale of the deception, but the confidence behind it. This was a man who believed he could control the narrative even after death. He believed he could divide his life cleanly, leaving me with grief and them with answers. What he hadn't planned for was me reading between the lines. As I turned each page, I saw the pattern clearly. Assets quietly split years ago. A life insurance policy redirected. A vacation home titled under a holding company I'd never heard of. And then, tucked near the back, something that made me pause. A copy of a trust agreement dated almost 20 years earlier with my signature on it. My real signature, not forged, not coerced. I remembered the day vaguely, him saying it was just a formality, something to protect us both if anything ever happened. I had trusted him, but trust, it turned out, cuts both ways. The trust named me as the primary controller, with authority triggered upon his death. He had forgotten one critical thing. I read everything before I sign, always had, always would. The realization settled slowly, not as triumph but as grounding. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't late. I wasn't trapped in someone else's ending. I closed the folder carefully, returned it to the drawer, and locked it again, not to hide the truth but to pace it. Revenge doesn't rush. It waits until every move is inevitable. The next morning I woke before dawn. Not from grief, but from focus. Grief clouds judgment. Focus sharpens it. I made coffee the way I always had, measured, steady, and sat at the kitchen table watching the sky lighten through the window. Somewhere in town, that woman was probably waking up too, rehearsing what she believed would be a difficult but ultimately profitable conversation with me. She likely thought she would appeal to sympathy, to fairness, maybe even to shared loss. What she didn't understand was that I had already separated emotion from action. By 8 o'clock, I was at my attorney's office, a woman I'd worked with years earlier when we updated our estate documents. She didn't offer condolences right away. She asked one question instead. "What did you find?" I placed the folder on her desk without ceremony. As she read, her expression shifted, not shock but recognition. "He planned this carefully," she said finally. I nodded. "So did I replied. That's when we reviewed the trust clause my husband had underestimated. The controlling authority transferred to me immediately upon his death. Not shared, not delayed, immediate. Every asset tied to that holding company now required my approval to move, sell, or claim, including the vacation home, including the accounts the other woman believed were hers by right. My attorney looked up and said something I will never forget. "Margaret, they don't know yet, but legally they can't touch anything without you." I didn't smile, I didn't celebrate, I simply felt something settle into place. Power doesn't announce itself when it arrives, it becomes quiet, intentional. That afternoon I returned home and answered the phone when it rang. It was her. Her voice was soft, careful. "I think we should talk," she said. I agreed, but on my terms. "Tomorrow," I replied, "at my lawyer's office." There was a pause on the line, just long enough for her to realize this conversation wasn't going to unfold the way she imagined. And in that pause, I knew. The reckoning had officially begun. She arrived the next day dressed for authority, not mourning, dark blazer, neutral heels, hair pulled back with intention. The two men, his sons, waited in the lobby, standing just behind her like proof. I noticed everything without commenting. My attorney greeted us calmly and led us into the conference room, where folders were already arranged with practiced precision. No one offered coffee. This wasn't a social visit. As soon as we sat, the woman began speaking, her voice steady, rehearsed. She talked about complex family situations, about shared responsibilities, about how my husband had intended fairness for everyone involved. I let her speak uninterrupted. People reveal more when you don't rush them. When she finally paused, my attorney slid a single document across the table toward her. The trust agreement. The one she clearly hadn't known existed. I watched her read the first page, then the second. Watched her posture shift. Watched confidence thin into calculation. "This can't be right," she said finally. My attorney answered for me. "It's very right. Mrs. Collins is the sole controlling trustee. Any assets tied to this structure are inaccessible without her written approval." One of the sons spoke up then, frustration cracking his voice. "But our father promised." I raised my hand gently, stopping him. It was the first time I'd spoken. "Your father made many promises," I said evenly. "Some of them he kept, some of them he didn't." Silence followed, heavy. Unavoidable. That's when I understood something important. They hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to claim. And people who arrive expecting to claim don't know how to react when they're told they must ask instead. The shift in the room was unmistakable after that. What had started as a carefully staged appeal turned into something rower, uncertainty mixed with resentment. The woman straightened her shoulders, trying to regain ground. "We were a family too," she said, her voice tightening. "He loved us. He provided for us. You can't just erase that." I looked at her then, not with anger, but with the kind of attention you give someone who has finally said the truth out loud. "I'm not erasing anything," I replied calmly. "I'm correcting what was hidden." One of the sons clenched his jaw, clearly struggling to reconcile the father he knew with the reality laid out on the table. My attorney spoke again, clinical and precise, explaining timelines, asset structures, and legal boundaries. Every sentence narrowed their options. The woman tried a different approach, emotion. She spoke of years spent in the background, of promises made in private, of sacrifices she believed entitled her to something tangible. I listened without interrupting because I understood something she didn't. Pain doesn't create ownership. Choices do. And my husband's final, documented choice, whether he intended it that way or not, had placed control firmly in my hands. When the meeting ended, no agreements were signed. No voices were raised. They left with nothing but clarity. As they walked out, the woman turned back once, her expression no longer confident, no longer composed. It was searching now, measuring. She realized too late that she had mistaken my quiet for confusion, and that mistake, like my husband's, was going to cost her far more than she expected. What followed wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, and that made it devastating. Over the next several weeks, I did exactly what the trust allowed me to do. I paused everything. Payments that had flowed quietly into accounts I'd never seen were halted. Maintenance requests on the vacation property were denied. Access to investment statements was restricted. Nothing disappeared. Nothing was seized. It simply stopped moving. That stillness created panic faster than confrontation ever could. My attorney handled every inquiry, every request, every thinly veiled threat that arrived dressed as concern. The woman's tone changed quickly, first polite, then frustrated, then desperate. She asked for compromise. She suggested mediation. She implied moral obligation. I declined all of it, not because I was cruel, but because clarity doesn't negotiate with entitlement. One afternoon, I received a message from one of the sons, short, restrained, asking if we could talk privately. I didn't respond. When people finally understand they have no leverage, they try to bypass the system. I had become the system. Friends asked how I was holding up, whether this felt like revenge. I told them the truth. This wasn't about punishment. It was about authorship. For decades, my life had been edited without my consent. Now I was writing the final version myself, quietly, legally, completely. As the weeks stretched on, something unexpected happened. I stopped thinking about them altogether. Not because the situation was resolved, but because my attention had returned to where it belonged, my own life. I reclaimed routines I'd abandoned without realizing it. Morning walks along the river, lunches with women who knew me before I became someone's wife and nothing else. I revisited old interests, reopened books I'd set aside, and allowed silence to exist without filling it with worry. The woman tried once more to reach me, this time through a carefully worded letter that spoke of shared grief and finding peace. I read it once and placed it in a drawer without responding. Peace doesn't come from splitting what was never meant to be shared. It comes from standing where the truth finally settles. I learned that strength at this stage of life isn't loud, it's selective. You choose where to spend your energy. You choose who gets access. You choose when the story ends. And with each passing day, I felt lighter, not because I'd won, but because I was no longer carrying what was never mine to begin with. The betrayal had revealed itself, but it no longer defined me. What defined me now was resolve, the kind that doesn't ask to be understood, only respected. By the time the final papers were signed and the dust truly settled, I understood something that took me decades to learn. Closure doesn't come from apologies, explanations, or even justice delivered by others. It comes from choosing yourself without guilt. I didn't need them to admit what they did. I didn't need remorse dressed up as maturity. I needed distance, dignity, and the quiet confidence of knowing I survived something meant to break me. I walked away with my name intact, my future protected, and my self-respect sharper than ever. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever been betrayed by the people who should have protected you, tell me in the comments. I want to know your story too. If this story touched something deep inside you, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, so more women who need this message can find it. Subscribe to the channel for powerful, real-life stories of betrayal, resilience, and unforgettable revenge. New stories every week. Comment below if you've ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted, or if this story reminded you of your own journey. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And remember this, always. Don't underestimate the power of women.